The battlefield smells like smoke and horse and iron. You are standing on a ridge in central Japan in the autumn of 1600, and below you, stretched across a valley so wide it takes several seconds just to scan from one end to the other, 80,000 men are about to kill each other. The fog hasn't lifted yet. It sits in the low places between the armies like something alive, and through it you can hear sounds that don't quite resolve into meaning. Drums, distant shouting, the particular creak of armor being settled onto shoulders for the last time by men who don't know it's the last time. The battle hasn't started, but it's already over, because on this ridge, at this exact moment, a man named Kobayakawa Hideaki is sitting on his horse and making a decision. He has 15,000 soldiers behind him. He has a promise in his left hand and a better offer in his right. And whichever way he moves in the next few minutes will determine who rules Japan for the next 250 years. He's 21 years old. He hasn't slept. And here's the thing nobody tells you. He already told both sides he would fight for them. Welcome back to Echoes of History. If the night is running long and your mind won't settle, I'm glad you found your way here. This is exactly the kind of story this channel was made for. If you haven't subscribed yet, 2 seconds is all it takes, and it means there's always something waiting the next time the dark gets loud. Drop a comment before you drift. Tell me where you are, what time it is. I love knowing who's out there in the quiet. Tonight we're going to the most consequential single act of battlefield betrayal in Japanese history, a decision made in fog, on a hillside, by a young man that history has never quite decided how to judge. Hero, traitor, pragmatist, coward, kingmaker. The answer is probably all of those at once. And the reason this story still matters 420 years later has nothing to do with samurai and everything to do with the moment you've been in yourself, standing between two commitments, knowing you can only honor one. Here's what most people think they know about the Battle of Sekigahara. They know it as the decisive clash that ended Japan's Sengoku period. The century of war, 100 years of warlords and shifting alliances and extraordinary violence that had consumed the country since the mid-1400s. They know Tokugawa Ieyasu won. They know the Tokugawa shogunate that followed lasted until 1868, longer than most modern nations have existed. They know Sekigahara as the hinge point between medieval Japan and early modern Japan. What most people don't know, what the broad historical narrative tends to flatten, is how close it was, not in military terms, in human terms. The margin between the world that happened and the world that almost happened was not genius strategy or superior numbers or better weapons. It was one man's decision on a hillside at a moment when the fog was still thick enough to hide what he was doing. And here is the reframe that changes everything about how you understand this battle. Tokugawa Ieyasu knew, going in, that he might lose. His intelligence told him the enemy coalition, the forces loyal to the Toyotomi clan, had a numerical advantage. He knew the terrain was unfavorable in places. He knew several of his allied commanders were unreliable. He knew the battle could go either way. So he didn't just prepare to fight, he prepared to buy. To understand Kobayakawa Hideaki, you need to understand the world he grew up in. He is the adopted nephew of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the man who, before Ieyasu, came closest to unifying Japan. Hideyoshi was one of the most remarkable figures in Japanese history, a peasant's son who rose to become the country's supreme ruler through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and what contemporary accounts describe as an almost supernatural ability to read people. He adopted Yaki as an infant, brought him into the household, gave him a name and a future and a set of obligations that would, 20 years later, put him on that ridge at Sekigahara. Hideyoshi dies in 1598. His son and heir, Toyotomi Hideyori, is 5 years old. A council of regents is supposed to govern until Hideyori comes of age. Tokugawa Ieyasu is the most powerful of those regents, and almost immediately he begins maneuvering, arranging marriages, building alliances, accumulating the kind of political gravity that only moves in one direction. By 1600, Japan has cracked along a clear fault line. On one side, forces loyal to the Toyotomi legacy, led by the administrator Ishida Mitsunari, fighting to preserve the world Hideyoshi built. On the other, Ieyasu and his allies, fighting to build something new with Ieyasu at its center. Hideaki, by blood and adoption, should be Toyotomi. His entire identity, his name, his land holdings, the reason he matters at all. It's all Toyotomi inheritance. Ishida Mitsunari has, in fact, been counting on his 15,000 soldiers for months. Plans have been built around them. Strategic positions have been assigned. When Mitsunari draws his battle maps, Hideki's forces are on them, sitting on the high ground of Mount Matsuo, positioned to sweep down on Ieyasu's eastern flank at the critical moment. But Hideaki has a problem with Mitsunari, a personal problem, a grudge that runs deep enough to change the shape of the world. Here's the piece of the story that most English language histories mention briefly and then move past. Several years before Sekigahara, Hideaki commanded Japanese forces in the Second Korean Campaign, one of Hideyoshi's disastrous attempts to invade the Korean peninsula and use it as a staging ground for conquering China. The campaign was a military catastrophe, and Ishida Mitsunari, as the campaign's administrator, filed formal complaints about Hideaki's conduct. He accused him of poor leadership, of excessive cruelty towards civilians, of decisions that cost lives and materiel unnecessarily. Hideaki was recalled in disgrace. Hideyoshi, still alive, stripped him of much of his domain. He was reduced, briefly, from a major lord to a minor one. Humiliated, demoted, his reputation shredded by a man he considered a bureaucrat playing soldier. Only Ieyasu's intercession restored him. Ieyasu quietly worked behind the scenes to have Hideki's domain returned. Ieyasu, who was even then building the credit he would collect at Sekigahara. So by the morning of October 21st, 1600, Kobayakawa Hideaki is sitting on a ridge commanding 15,000 men, officially committed to the Toyotomi cause, personally indebted to the man he's supposed to destroy. He has received a letter from Ieyasu. The letter makes an offer. It guarantees his domains. It promises elevation. It is, in the cold calculus of survival, the better deal. He sits on his horse in the fog. He does not move. The battle begins without him. For 3 hours, Sekigahara is genuinely uncertain. Ieyasu's forces engage the Toyotomi coalition in the valley, and despite everything, despite his preparations, despite the bribes and the letters and the intelligence gathering, he is not winning. The fighting is brutal and close, and the coalition forces are holding. Mitsunari is where he's supposed to be. His generals are executing. The battle plan is working. And on Mount Matsuo, Kobayakawa Hideaki watches. He watches for 3 hours. His 15,000 men watch with him. The fog lifts. The sun comes up. The valley below becomes completely visible. The formations, the banners, the places where Ieyasu's lines are under pressure. Mitsunari sends messengers. Move. The signal has been given. This is the moment. Move. Hideaki does not move. Here is a detail that has fascinated historians for centuries, and when you hear it you will understand why. At some point during those 3 hours of stillness, the accounts vary on exactly when. Tokugawa Ieyasu, watching Hideki's motionless 15,000 from his command position, makes a decision. He orders his own arquebusiers to fire on Kobayakawa's position, not to attack him, not to kill him, to force the question. Because Ieyasu understands, with the clarity of a man who has spent 50 years reading people, that Hideaki is not going to move on his own. The commitment is made. The letter is sent. The deal is real. But the man on the horse cannot make himself move, cannot make himself cross the line from betrayal in theory to betrayal in fact, without something external to blame it on, without a reason that isn't purely his own choice. The shots hit near Hideki's position. No one is killed, but the sound changes something. Kobayakawa Hideki raises his war fan. 15,000 men begin to move. What happens next takes approximately 3 minutes to decide and roughly 6 hours to complete. Hideki's forces sweep down from Mount Matsuo into the flank of the Toyotomi coalition, not into Ieyasu's forces, into the men who were counting on him, into the armies that had built their entire battle plan around the assumption that he would be there when it mattered. The effect is immediate and total. The coalition doesn't retreat, it collapses. Mitsunari watches his formations dissolve with a speed that no military response can address, because there is no military response to 15,000 soldiers suddenly attacking from a position that was supposed to be yours. He fights for hours more, because that is what he does, but the outcome is fixed within minutes of Hideki's descent. Ishida Mitsunari is captured 3 days later. He is brought to Kyoto and executed. Before his death, by multiple accounts, he is offered food and declines, not from despair, but from a stated concern that eating would make him need to urinate during his execution, and he finds the image undignified. He goes to his death thinking about his dignity. Kobayakawa Hideaki receives his promised domains. He receives elevation. He receives everything Ieyasu's letter offered. He lives for 2 more years. He dies in 1602 at the age of 23, and the accounts suggest he spent much of those 2 years drinking heavily and behaving erratically, what one contemporary describes in terms that feel startlingly modern, as a man haunted by what he'd seen himself do. He never spoke publicly about Sekigahara, not once, not on record. Here is the strange dimension, the question that this story is actually asking. When Ieyasu fired those warning shots, when he gave Hideki the external push that the young man couldn't give himself, was that manipulation or mercy? Think about it. Ieyasu understood that Hideki had already made his choice. The letter was accepted, the deal was real. What he hadn't done was act on it, because acting on it meant becoming, fully and irrevocably, the man who betrayed the house that made him. Ieyasu's shots didn't change Hideaki's decision. They gave him permission to execute it. They gave him a story to tell himself, I was fired upon. I responded. The sequence of events pushed me. It's possible to read this as cold manipulation, a warlord exploiting a young man's psychological paralysis for strategic advantage. It's also possible to read it as Ieyasu doing the most honest thing anyone did that day, acknowledging that the choice was already made, and making it possible to act on it. Because here's the connection to right now. You have been Kobayakawa Hideaki, maybe not on a ridge with 15,000 soldiers, but in the structure of the experience, you have sat between 2 commitments, knowing which one you were actually going to honor, unable to move until something external gave you permission. A conversation that forced the question, a deadline that arrived, someone who fired the warning shot. We tell ourselves we make decisions. Often what we do is wait for permission to act on decisions already made. The fog clears, the sun comes up, and we are still sitting on the horse, war fan at our side, waiting for something outside ourselves to begin what's already finished inside. Let the room find you, your specific room, your specific dark. The valley of Sekigahara is farmland now. Quiet, green, completely ordinary looking in the way that all places where vast things happened eventually become ordinary. There's a museum. There are informational signs. People drive past it on the highway. But in October every year, the fog still comes into that valley the same way it came in 1600. It sits in the low places. It muffles sound. It makes the distance between one ridge and another feel uncertain, provisional, subject to revision. And somewhere in that fog, in the version of this story that lives in the past and doesn't change, a 21-year-old is still sitting on his horse, still holding 2 promises, still waiting. He's going to move in a minute. He always does. He always will. You know exactly how that feels. Let the knowing settle into your chest and soften there. Let your breath find its own rhythm. The decisions you're sitting with, the ones where you already know the answer and haven't moved yet, they can wait until morning. Tonight, rest. The fog will lift when it lifts. Thank you for being here with Echoes of History tonight. If this story stayed with you, a like helps more than you know. It's how other quiet minds find their way to this channel. Leave a comment before you sleep. Where are you? What time is it? Which part of this story landed closest? I read every one, and I'm always glad to know who's out there. Channel membership is open if you want to go deeper into nights like this one. No pressure, no urgency, just a quieter room for people who like this kind of dark. Subscribe if you haven't. Come back whenever the night gets long. We are all, in the end, on some ridge or another. Fog below us. A choice already made that we haven't acted on yet, and eventually, always eventually, the war fan rises. Sleep well. The story keeps.